Jack didn't tell anyone about his lip because he had learned a long time ago that telling made things worse. He was 8 years old and he had already learned this, which was the kind of thing that should never happen to an 8-year-old, and which had happened anyway. Gradually, over 4 years of living in a house where the rules changed depending on whether his father was home. When his father was home, the house was warm. There was music in the kitchen on weekend mornings, and his dad made eggs the way Jack liked them, with the edges slightly crispy. And they watched football on Sunday afternoons, and his dad fell asleep on the couch with his arm around Jack, and it felt like the safest place in the world. When his father was not home, the temperature changed. Not all at once. That was the thing that made it hard to explain, or would have made it hard to explain if Jack had tried to explain it to anyone, which he had not, because he had learned that trying to explain things made it worse. It started with a mood, something tight and compressed in Carol's face when she heard them running in the hallway, or when the homework wasn't finished by the time she decided it should be finished, or when dinner was too loud, or not loud enough, or when Jack asked for something she hadn't offered. And from the mood, it went to the voice, and from the voice, it went to the hand. And the hand had been getting worse for the last 6 months in a way that Jack could measure without being able to articulate, the way children measure things they don't have words for yet. His father had been gone for 4 days. He was coming back tomorrow. Today was the worst day yet. It had started at breakfast over a spilled glass of orange juice, Jack's fault, an accident, the kind of thing that happens when you are 8 and your hands are still learning to be reliable. Carol had gone very still, the way she went still before things happened. Thomas had seen it. Thomas was 11 and he had a faster internal alarm than Jack, because he was older and had been watching longer. And he had stood up from the table and stepped between Jack and Carol the way he always did when he could get there in time. He had not gotten there in time. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds. Jack knew this because he had started counting things when bad things happened, the way his dad had taught him to count when he was scared. And he had counted to 22 before it was over. When it was over, Jack was on the kitchen floor with his lip split and the taste of blood in his mouth, which was copper and salt and the specific taste of something that should not be happening. Thomas was standing in front of him with his arms out, which was what Thomas always did after, putting himself between Jack and whatever came next. Carol stood at the kitchen counter with her hands flat on the surface and her head down. She was breathing. Jack watched her breathe and counted her breaths too, because it was the only thing he could think to do. 32. 33. On 38, she lifted her head. Her face had the expression it always had after, which was not remorse and not guilt, but something more like the face of a person recalibrating, assessing what had happened and what it meant and what came next. She looked at Jack on the floor. She looked at Thomas standing in front of him. "Clean that up," she said, meaning the orange juice, and she walked out of the kitchen. Thomas turned around. He crouched in front of Jack. He had his father's eyes, brown and direct, and he looked at Jack's lip with the expression of a boy who has been handling things beyond his years for long enough that it showed in his face. He reached up and touched Jack's chin gently, tilting his face to look at the damage. "Okay?" he said. "Yeah," Jack said, which was not true, but it was the answer they both used because the other answers were too large for the kitchen. Thomas found a clean cloth and wet it and pressed it against Jack's lip. It stung sharply, and Jack breathed through his nose the way his dad had taught him. His dad had taught him a lot of things about getting through pain quietly. He had thought at the time that his dad was teaching him about scraped knees and sports injuries. He understood now that his dad might have been teaching him something else without knowing he was teaching it. His dad was coming home tomorrow. Jack looked at Thomas over the cloth pressed to his lip. "Don't tell Dad," he said. Thomas looked at him. His jaw tightened. He was 11 years old, and his jaw did things when he was angry that made him look older than 11. "Jack." "It'll just make everything worse," Jack said. "You know it will. She'll be angrier after, and Dad'll feel bad, and then he'll leave again, and then—" "Stop," Thomas said. His voice was flat. "Just stop." He sat back on his heels and looked at the kitchen floor and breathed. He had their father's way of breathing when he was trying to control something, deep and deliberate. The way you breathe when you're deciding what to do instead of just reacting to what happened. Jack watched him and waited. He didn't know that in the front hallway, where their father had left it that morning before his trip because he always forgot something and had come back for it and found the spare key under the mat, his father's jacket was hanging on the hook by the door. He didn't know that his father's conference had ended a day early. He didn't know that his father was already in a taxi. Subscribe right now, because what Daniel Reed did when he walked through that door is not what Carol expected. It is not what anyone expected. And it started the moment he saw his son's face. Daniel Reed was 39 years old. He had lived in Millbrook for 6 years. He worked for an accounting firm and drove a sensible car and coached Thomas's soccer team on weekends and made crispy-edged eggs on Sunday mornings. He was quiet in the way that people who have processed a great deal become quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned to choose carefully what they say and when they say it. His neighbors knew him as steady. His colleagues knew him as thorough. The parents at Thomas's school knew him as the dad who always remembered everyone's kids' names and showed up early to help set up equipment. Nobody in Millbrook knew what he had done for 11 years before he moved there. He had been a senior investigator for the state's Child Protective Services Division, specializing in cases of physical abuse. He had spent 11 years walking into houses and reading rooms the way other people read books, seeing the evidence that didn't announce itself, the flinch that came half a second too fast, the answer that was almost right, but not quite, the specific, careful distance a child kept between itself and an adult who should have been safe. He had built cases and testified in court and gotten children into safer situations, and he had been, by every measure, very good at his job. And then there had been Caleb. Caleb Morrison, 7 years old. The file had been flagged twice before Daniel inherited it. He had understood immediately what he was looking at. He had needed 3 more weeks to build a sufficient case. He had not had 3 weeks. On a Tuesday morning in November, Caleb had gone to the hospital for the last time. Daniel left the job 4 months later. He moved to Millbrook. He met Susan at a school fundraiser, and Susan had been warm and present and had loved his boys completely, and he had believed the chapter before Millbrook was sealed. Susan died of an aneurysm 3 years ago. No warning, nothing to be done. He met Carol 8 months later, lonely in the specific way grief makes you lonely, and Carol had seemed, in the beginning, to be fond of the boys. He had not been paying the right kind of attention. He had been paying the attention of a man who wanted things to be okay, which was a different instrument entirely from the attention he had spent 11 years training. He had come back to that understanding slowly over the past year, catching things at the edges of his vision and then talking himself out of what he'd seen. The dynamic that was slightly off, the way Thomas positioned himself, the way Jack answered questions about his day in the particular flat tone of a child who has been taught, without words, that certain things were not for saying. He had told himself he was being paranoid, professional distortion, seeing patterns from old work in places they didn't exist. He had been wrong. The conference ended at noon. The afternoon session had been canceled, and Daniel had booked the earlier train without examining why. He told himself it would be a nice surprise. He told himself the boys would like it. He was good at telling himself things. He had been doing it for a year. But somewhere below the telling, the instrument that he had spent 11 years training was running its own calculation, quiet and certain. And it was why his hands felt too still on the train, and why he watched the landscape without seeing it the entire ride home. The taxi dropped him at the end of the street. He always walked the last block home, a habit from years of arriving at houses where he needed to think before he knocked. He came up the front path and took his key from his pocket. He opened the door. The house was quiet, the particular quality of quiet that was different from the quiet of an empty house. He stepped into the hallway and put his bag down and stood for a moment, listening. He heard Thomas's voice from the kitchen, low and controlled, older than 11. And then Jack's voice, answering in the flat tone. He walked to the kitchen doorway. Thomas was crouched on the floor in front of Jack with a cloth pressed to Jack's lip, and the cloth had blood on it, and Jack's face was the specific white of a child in pain who has decided not to show it. And something happened in Daniel's chest in that moment that he did not have a word for. It was not rage, though the rage was there, deep and cold and total. It was recognition. He had stood in many doorways over 11 years and seen variations of this scene, and every time the instrument in him had immediately and precisely understood what he was looking at and what it meant, and what had caused it. He had never been wrong. He was not wrong now. He looked at his sons. Thomas had heard him and turned, still crouched, still with the cloth in his hand. His face went through several things very quickly. Relief, fear of what came next, the specific guilt of a child who believes that if he had been better or faster or stronger, the thing that happened would not have happened. Jack was looking at him with an expression that broke something open in Daniel's chest. It was the expression of a child who loves his parent and is afraid for that parent to know what is happening, because he believes in the particular illogical logic of children who have been hurt in homes, that knowing will make things worse for someone. He was 8 years old, and he was trying to protect his father. Daniel breathed, in through his nose, very slowly, out through his mouth. He crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of Jack and looked at his lip with the careful, clinical attention that he had spent 11 years developing and that he had tried to put away in Millbrook and had not, it turned out, successfully put away. "Let me see," he said. His voice was completely level. Jack let him look. The split was not deep, but it was recent, less than an hour, still slightly swollen at the edges. He looked at Jack's face, at the rest of it, checking the way he had learned to check. "Does anything else hurt?" he said. Jack shook his head. Daniel did not fully believe this, but filed it. He looked at Thomas. "Are you hurt?" Thomas shook his head. His jaw was tight, and he was watching his father's face with intense attention, trying to read it, because Thomas had learned to read faces the way children learn to read the weather in houses like theirs, as a survival skill. "Okay," Daniel said. He stood up. He reached down and put his hand briefly on top of Jack's head, just for a moment, just contact. The specific contact that said, "I see you, and I'm here, and I know." Then he turned toward the hallway. Carol was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had heard him come in. She had come to find out which version of the afternoon she was dealing with, the manageable version or the one that required handling. She was good at handling things. She had been handling Daniel for 2 years, knowing which tone to use and which version of events to present, and how to position herself in the space between what had happened and what he would accept as having happened. She had never seen his face look like this. In 2 years, she had seen him frustrated, tired, sad, warm, laughing, thoughtful, occasionally sharp. She had filed all of these and understood how to work with each of them. She had built a comprehensive internal map of Daniel Reed, and she was confident in her navigation of it. The face in the kitchen doorway was not on her map. It was completely still. Not the stillness of a man controlling anger, something more fundamental than that. The stillness of a person who has stopped performing any expression at all, who has set aside the entire apparatus of social presentation because the moment no longer requires it. His eyes were on her face, and they were reading her the way she had seen no one read anything, with a precision that felt like being taken apart and examined, component by component, without any possibility of misdirection. She understood, in the 2 seconds before he spoke, that she had made a serious error in her understanding of who this man was. She felt her legs weaken. She felt something happen in her chest that she had not felt since she was a child herself, in her own terrible childhood, which was the feeling of a person who has been operating under a false assumption about the power structure of their situation and has just discovered the truth. She went to her knees. She did not decide to. Her body made the decision before her mind caught up, the old animal response to a specific kind of threat, the response that said, "This is not a situation you can manage. This is a situation you can only survive." "Daniel," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He looked at her on the floor. He did not move. His expression did not change. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know what happened. It was just the juice, and it won't happen again, I promise. I can explain." "Don't," he said. One word, quiet and absolute and final. She stopped. He stood for a moment, still looking at her, and she could see him making decisions she could not read, which was the most frightening thing she had experienced in years, because she had always been able to read the decisions. And then he turned away from her, which was somehow worse than anything she had imagined, being turned away from, being rendered irrelevant by the simple act of a man turning to face something else. He went to the kitchen table. He sat down. He took his phone from his pocket. He made a call. Carol watched him from her knees on the floor. She did not get up. She did not speak. She heard him say a name she recognized from the first year of their marriage, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hollis, whom he had described as an old colleague and whom Carol had looked up once and found was a licensed clinical psychologist with a subspecialty in child trauma assessment. She had thought nothing of it at the time. She was thinking of it now. "Patricia," Daniel said. His voice had changed. It was the voice he used when he was being precise. She had heard this voice twice before, both times when he was on the phone about work, and she had noted it and filed it and not understood what it meant. "I need you, today, now, if you can." He paused. "Yes, both of them." He listened. "Thank you." He hung up. He made a second call. This one she did not recognize, a name she had never heard. He spoke briefly, with the same precise voice, and said the address, and said today. He made a third call. This one she heard clearly. It was a family attorney named Warren Cole, whose name she knew because it was on the documents she had signed when she and Daniel married. She heard Daniel say, "I need the process started today, Warren, not the week after. Today." A pause. "Because I'm looking at the reason right now and I'm not waiting." Carol sat on the kitchen floor and felt her life reorganizing itself around her into a shape she had not chosen and could not stop. Jack had come to sit at the kitchen table while she wasn't paying attention. He was watching his father make calls with the expression of a child who is watching something he doesn't fully understand but can feel the weight of. Thomas had come to stand near the table too, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, watching. Daniel finished the third call and set the phone on the table. He looked at his sons. "Are you hungry?" he said. Jack blinked. "What?" "It's past lunchtime," Daniel said. "Are you hungry?" This was so far from what Jack had expected that he simply said, "Yeah." "Okay," Daniel said. He stood up. He went to the refrigerator with the complete, ordinary focus of a man making lunch, and he began to make sandwiches. And he made them the way he always made them, with the specific attention he brought to small things, making sure the bread was even and the filling reached the edges. Carol watched this from the floor and understood, finally, fully, the kind of person she had underestimated. He was not exploding. He was not threatening. He was not losing control in any of the ways she had prepared for. He had seen what he needed to see. He had made 3 phone calls, and now he was making his son's lunch. And the 3 calls he had made were already in motion and would not be stopped. She had been married to this man for 2 years, and she had constructed a detailed and confident understanding of him. She had been wrong about every significant thing. She had seen the quietness and understood it as weakness. She had seen the steadiness and understood it as limitation. She had seen the patience and understood it as absence. It was not any of those things. She understood that now, from the floor of her kitchen, watching him cut a sandwich diagonally because Jack preferred it that way. Dr. Patricia Hollis arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had done difficult work for a long time and had found a way to do it without being destroyed by it. She shook Daniel's hand in the hallway with the recognition of people who have worked together through hard things. She sat with Thomas and Jack in the living room for 45 minutes, while Daniel sat in the kitchen. Carol had been asked by Daniel, quietly and without cruelty, to wait in the bedroom. She had gone because the alternative was to stay and be looked at by Patricia Hollis, and she found she could not do that. She sat on the edge of the bed in the bedroom where she had slept for 2 years and listened to the quiet sounds of the house and understood that she was listening to the sound of a situation that was entirely outside her control, which was a feeling she had not experienced since she was very young, and which she had spent her whole life ensuring she would never feel again. She had failed. Warren Cole, the attorney, arrived at 4. He and Daniel sat at the kitchen table. Carol heard their voices but not their words. It lasted an hour. The second person from Daniel's second call, a woman who turned out to be a Child Protective Services intake coordinator named Susan Park, arrived at 5. She was professional and direct, and spoke to Thomas and Jack separately, briefly, with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly how to do this without it being additionally traumatic. When she finished, she spoke to Daniel in the hallway for 10 minutes. Carol could not hear this conversation at all. Daniel knocked on the bedroom door at 6:15. He opened it and stood in the doorway and looked at her with the same expression he had worn all day, the one that was not on her map. "Patricia assessed the boys," he said. "She's recommending follow-up sessions for both of them. Thomas has been managing more than he should have to manage for a long time. Jack is resilient, but there are things that need to be addressed." He paused. "Susan's report goes to the county office tomorrow morning. Warren has the filing for dissolution. You'll receive the paperwork by end of the week." He looked at her steadily. "You should call someone tonight, a family member, a friend, someone who can come. You should not be alone, and you should not be here." Carol looked at him. "Daniel, I'm not angry at you," he said. And the terrible thing, the thing that she would carry with her for a long time afterward, was that this was true. He was not angry. He was something beyond anger, on the other side of it, in the territory of a person who has made a complete and irrevocable decision and is already living in the world after that decision. "I'm telling you what is happening so you can prepare. That is the only conversation I have left to have with you." He closed the door. She sat on the bed and heard him in the kitchen talking to his sons, the ordinary warm voice, the voice that belonged to a man who made crispy-edged eggs and remembered everyone's kids' names and turned to face hard things with the stillness of someone who had been trained to face them. She had seen the stillness and thought it was softness. She had been wrong. Thomas came to find his father after Carol left that evening, while Jack was asleep on the couch. He stood in the kitchen doorway in the same spot where, this morning, he had stood between his brother and something that should never have reached his brother. His father was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. He looked up when Thomas came in. Thomas sat across from him. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the evening light was leaving the sky. "You knew," Thomas said. "Not an accusation, an understanding. Before today, you knew something was wrong." His father was quiet for a moment. "I was slow," he said. That's not the same as not knowing. I talked myself out of what I was seeing." He looked at Thomas with the direct honesty that had always been the thing Thomas trusted most about him. "That's on me. Not you, not Jack. Me." Thomas was quiet. He looked at the table. "I thought if I told you, you'd feel bad," he said. "I thought you'd blame yourself and then be sad, and then leave on another trip, and then—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I don't know." "I know," his father said. "You were protecting me." He said it without softness and without anything that would make Thomas feel that he needed to manage his father's feelings about it. He said it like a fact, because it was a fact. "You've been doing that for a long time. You don't have to anymore." Thomas looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," his father said. "Not for a work trip and not any other way. I'm staying right here." He put his hand on the table between them, not reaching across, just placing it there, available. "That's it. That's what I have to say." Thomas looked at his father's hand on the table. He put his own hand over it. They sat like that while the light finished leaving and the kitchen got dark, and neither of them moved to turn on the lights because neither of them needed to. Jack slept on the couch with his swollen lip and his counted breaths. And tomorrow, Dr. Hollis would come back and begin the careful work of helping him put words to the things he had been carrying without words. And it would take time, and some of what had been done to him would leave marks that took years to fade. And some things could not be taken back. But tonight, his father was home. Tonight, his father was staying. And in the kitchen, in the dark, Thomas Reed kept his hand over his father's and let himself, for the first time in a very long time, feel something he had almost stopped expecting to feel. Safe. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a comment. For every Thomas who stood in the doorway, for every Jack who learned to count to stay calm, and for every father who came home.